Hello and welcome to this Institute for Manufacturing webinar. We're delighted that Professor John Clarkson is joining us as a guest speaker to share his expertise. I'm Kate Wilshire, Chief Operations Officer of IFM Education and Consultancy Services, the knowledge transfer arm of the Institute for Manufacturing. So firstly, to introduce the IFM for those of you that are new to us. The Institute for Manufacturing is part of the University of Cambridge's Department of Engineering. We bring together expertise across management, technology and policy to address a range of manufacturing issues. I work for the knowledge transfer arm of the IFM Education and Consultancy Services, transferring IFM research, tools and approaches through working closely with organisations from across industry, government and academia. During this year, we've been holding a series of webinars focusing on healthcare to share the insights from the IFM in this important area. The IFM conducts research and collaborates with organisations from across the healthcare ecosystem, right from clinical trial production all the way across to distribution and use. We were recently delighted to receive an award from the Royal Academy of Engineering in recognition of the work that we've done in response to the COVID pandemic. The webinars give examples about some of the collaborations that we've been working on across the healthcare ecosystem. Professor John Clarkson is a long-term collaborator of the IFM and has worked on many projects with us over the years. He's director of the Cambridge Engineering Design Centre, professor of healthcare at Delft University, healthcare systems at Delft University, and co-chair of Cambridge Public Health. He was the working group chair for the Royal Academy of Engineering project Engineering Better Care, a project that informs much of the presentation today. We're really grateful to John for joining us today. Over to you, John.
So thank you. I will just try and get the presentation. I don't really know what I was thinking when we put that title together, because I'm not sure I'm going to talk about systems engineering, but rather more a systems approach to looking at complexity. So what I intend to do is to talk rather more about the healthcare side of things as the inspiration behind this, and reflect on how what I've learned about a systems approach in healthcare might apply in policy, and then right at the end come back and say, well, how might that reflect back to the work we did in industry? So I thought I'd start and say a little bit about where I've come from, the point of background. So before I went to university, I started work with the General Electric company, English Electric Valve company. And it was interesting, formative time. I got used to working with all sorts of interesting devices like the camera tube on the left and the klystron on the right, which is broadcasting equipment. And although it was sort of electronics, it was sculptural electronics. And I got fascinated by the interplay between the mechanical design of these devices and their electrical performance. And I did a degree in general engineering, specialized in electrical engineering, and a PhD in stepping motor systems. And then I went to work for PA Consulting Group. And some of the projects that left their mark include developing the control system for a fire training unit prototype for the Royal Navy. So something that would respond to people putting extinguishers on real flames and control them accordingly. And then working on a familiar product to some, the widget beer, one of the early widget beers. And I wasn't involved in the product design or the design of the manufacturing process. And yet I learned about the interplay between those two and the advertising. I was actually the safety manager, the person who ensured that people on the production line would not die from excess nitrogen. But I had to understand the whole system to play that role. I also did a lot of work in the medtech sector. And for example, on that discus inhaler on the left-hand side, I was involved in putting a computer inside that device to monitor its effectiveness in use. And the breath-operated inhalers on the right, my job and the last job I did at PA was to develop and deliver the test equipment to be used on the production line for that inhaler. And I still use it as a prime example of a case study for my fourth-year students. But all of that time, I guess that early decade of my engineering career, it really came down fundamentally to two questions. How can we do it better? And what could possibly go wrong? That seems to me the bit balance of what good engineering is about. We want to do things better, but we're trying to balance that with a view of what can go wrong. And I also learned at PA that it's all about the process. It's the way in which you go about trying to deliver these two things. So at that point, and over 25 years ago, I came back to the Department of Engineering in the University of Cambridge. And I've been there as director of the Engineering Design Centre for most of that time. The focus of that centre is about improving the design process. So in a sense, a very good match for my interests in what I've been doing previously is it's about the process. It's about how we go about design. And I spent a lot of the past 25 years working in two different, quite distinctive areas. One in the engineering sector, working for Rolls-Royce, Jaguar Land Rover, Airbus and others, looking at the complexity of these large-scale products that they come up with and how things are connected and how change ripples through complex systems and how do we come up with better design processes. And the other half of my world has been how do we design for people? So inclusive design, design for the elderly and disabled. And I started out doing work in medtech, trying to understand the design processes for medical technology, through to then understanding, well, what does design look like for healthcare improvement? And it's that piece of the puzzle I wanted to focus on now. So I'm going to sort of switch roles, if you like, to work I did starting 5 years ago with the Royal Academy of Engineering. And they asked me to chair this working group. And the exam question, if you like, was to work with the health and care professions to explore how engineers can add to current understanding and practice of systems engineering in quality improvement and healthcare design. And this is against a backdrop of about 30 years of reports coming out from healthcare saying it might have helped if they took a systems approach, but nobody had really decided or defined or told us what that meant. And yet from the engineering side, we sort of know where to start. We might say that systems that work do not just happen. They have to be planned, designed and built. Now, that's all very well for a blank sheet of paper design, but quite challenging when you're in a system and you're trying to improve it. You may not have that luxury of starting from scratch. And then if we look at the systems engineering world, we have this V model, which is at least 30 years in the making. It's an extraordinary picture that describes really all that's important about systems engineering, the nuances of how things are connected and the shape and direction of the arrows are really important. But it's utterly unintelligible unless you've grown up in that world and understand how to interpret it and to use it. So at that point, if we're talking to a healthcare audience, we tend to back off and give them a chance to understand what an engineer actually is.
I'm worried about little Dilbert. He's not like other kids.
What do you mean?
Yesterday, I left him alone for a minute, and he disassembled the TV, our clock, and the stereo.
That's perfectly normal. Kids take things apart.
Oh! The part that worries me is he used the components to build a ham radio set.
Oh dear.
Is that bad?
Normally I'd want to run an EEG on him, but the machine isn't working. It's worse than I feared.
What is it?
I'm afraid your son has the knack.
The knack?
The knack. It's a rare condition characterized by an extreme intuition about all things mechanical and electrical, and utter social ineptitude.
Can he lead a normal life?
No. He'll be an engineer.
No!
There.
The healthcare folk wouldn't believe it. They love it that they think they can diagnose engineers. So I diagnosed over 40 years ago, but we knew we couldn't start with that systems engineering view. So we backed off a bit and we said, well, what about different perspectives on a systems approach? So we can think about systems, design, risk, and people as different perspectives. And we ran workshops in each of those areas. And what I'm going to describe now is some of the messaging and stories that came out of those workshops to try and unpack those perspectives. So when we talk to clinicians and improvers about the human body, they understand systems of systems straight away, the waterproofing system, the plumbing system, the digestive system, and so on. They know the performance of the whole is far greater than the sum of the parts. They know if one of the systems isn't working or there's some geographical damage to the body, that it compromises the performance of the whole. But you can take them on a slightly different journey and say, well, what about the patient going to see the GP, inquiring about some challenge that they have? And the GP might consult the formulary or some computer software and write a prescription. which the patient then takes to the pharmacy, who have a delivery and dispensing system. They give them the right medication with the right dose and labeled on it to make sure they take the right thing. They take it home and put it in their system. And this is typical for a patient over aged about 65 or 70. And it's up to the patient then to make sure they get the right dose of the right medication at the right time. And if all of that works, and the research systems work and the manufacturing distribution systems work, we've got half a chance of giving the patient the right dose of the right medication when they need it. And there are questions that might come out of that. We say, well, who are the stakeholders? Who are the people that have an interest in making that system work? What are the elements or the parts of the system? And how does the system perform if all those parts come together? And we could see that as a systems perspective on the systems approach. From a design point of view, we always came back to the double diamond model from the Design Council. What I really like about this particular picture is it really emphasizes the challenge, the exploration required to go from the need and translate it to a definition of the problem before you go seeking the ideas and concepts and developing them into the final solution. And there's many people who come to me and say, look, I think I know what the answer is. And I haven't even defined the problem, let alone try to think through what the need is that sits behind that. So this is really important in saying that there are two stages to good design. And you can apply that to simple equipment like blood pressure monitoring equipment for use in hospitals or primary care or wherever. It could be a piece of equipment to be set in a suite of equipment to be used in the complex environment of theatre. It has to work. Or it could be something more than that. This is a G750 scanner for use with children. And the child is promised an undersea adventure. And when they come to the hospital, everybody's in costume. And they take them on this wild adventure. And the rumblings of the scanner are put down to the engine room of the submarine. And they're told to lie really still so that nobody knows they're down there. And success is a clear scan image. And the child's so excited they want to come back tomorrow and do it all over again. So it might be you're designing the whole experience beyond just the equipment. Or if you take this defibrillator for use by the general public, not only does the kit have to work first time, the novice user who's never seen one before has to be able to open it and follow the instructions and use it correctly first time. So maybe it's the information content as well as the product that have to be designed together. And the questions that might arise out of this is, well, what are the needs? How can the needs be met and how well are the needs met? And those are the design related questions about a systems approach. If we then think about risk, so the only time we put up an engineering-like diagram in front of our clinical colleagues to say, look, if you have some outcome that you consider most of the time is normal, risk is normally about trying to avoid the accidents, trying to understand the threat of the accidents and avoid them. But equally, it's about looking for the things you do exceptionally well and looking for the opportunity to learn from what you do particularly well. It's about moving the whole of that curve to the right. And we can apply engineering principles of risk management to things like central line insertion. And we've studied this long enough to know that at this particular point in the cycle, if you were to disturb the operator, they might actually forget whether that wire they're about to grab is in or outside of the patient. And it doesn't kill people, but it's pretty inconvenient to have to go back inside somebody to find the wire afterwards because you've left it in there. And equally, we know a team in Swansea that studies infusion pumps, which are commonplace in hospitals. And there's a pump on the market that if you are trying to tap in 15.7 and you tap in 15.5, delete 7, you've actually now tapped in 157. And it looks like a failure of the operator, a mistake of the operator. Actually, it's just bad design. So we can apply these sort of observation techniques to quite complex processes and understand whether they've been designed effectively or not. And when you're asking that question, what could possibly go wrong, you can equally apply it to other systems in the hospital. You've got a shift change on a ward. What could possibly go wrong? And you can interrogate that whole process and behave and what's going on and try and understand what's going on, or conversely, what do you do particularly well and how do you encourage that behavior? But equally, people just make mistakes. And this is Hamilton 2013 Malaysia. He's just switched from driving with McLaren to driving with Mercedes. First pit stop in a race for Mercedes, he stops at the McLaren pit. And they quietly just wave him on down the line to the Mercedes pit. So people make genuine mistakes. So how do we design systems to allow for that, to minimize the impact of those errors? So the questions might be, what is going on? You need to know what's going on before you can assess something. And then the double-ended questions, what could go wrong, or what do we do well? And then how can we make it better? And you can already start to see the overlap between the risk perspectives and the design and systems perspectives. And then there's people. And that started out focusing primarily on sort of diversity within the patient population and within the carer population. So for example, if somebody has arthritis and struggles opening jam jars, why would you give them their medication in a child-resistant container? It encourages all sorts of quite unsafe coping strategies. That same medication I showed you before, this is now in the morning without your glasses on. The one you can vaguely see at the top left must be taken weekly. If you take it daily, you die horribly. And everything else in that box you take daily. And we conspire in the UK at the moment to make everything look the same. What could possibly go wrong? What about the language we use when we talk about healthcare issues? Is it clear, concise, consistent, so that everybody understands what's being said, whether patient or practitioner? I'm not sure that's true at the moment. And if you have a team come up with some improvement on a particular ward, should the ward next door be able to take that solution, or the rest of the hospital, or another hospital? I think probably not, without proper consideration of what it is they're trying to achieve and whether that's the right answer. So again, questions come out of this. Who will use the system? Where is the system? And what affects the system? So we have a bunch of questions, and it's a bit like the juggler, that the performance is only complete if you keep all the balls in the air. It's about people, systems, design, and risk. And we can pull all those questions together in one place, and they form a natural order. We've taken out a couple that overlap, and it starts at the top and iterates clockwise around the diagram. And most of the questions on the right-hand side are predominantly about understanding what the problem is and the context. And most of those on the left are really about the solution and evaluation. But it is iterative. And when we talk back to the improvers about this, we suggested, well, maybe the process you have in very general terms is about trying to go from the current performance critically to something measurably better. And as you do that, you go through a process of understanding, designing, delivering, and maybe sustaining that solution. And all the while you're decreasing the risk in what you're doing, and you're increasing the clarity of what the final solution looks like. Now, whatever your process might look like for improvement, what we suggested then at the time is that those questions that we've come up wrap around that process, and they're used throughout in an iterative manner. But at the front end of that process on the left, predominantly will be those right-hand questions. What's the context? What's the problem? And as you go through the process, more and more the questions on the left about the solution and evaluation. And the other observations we took out of those early workshops was that people were surprised that engineers think about people. And most of what we do in engineering, we think about people. We talk about iteration before implementation. We try and iterate and take the challenges out before we take the product or service to market. We see design as an exploratory process. It's about exploring the need to find the problem, exploring the problem to find the right solution. The risk management is a proactive process. What could possibly go wrong? As well as looking at the mistakes and errors, saying, well, what actually went wrong? And that thinking changes practice, but maybe process helps. And what we're driving at here is we came up with a set of questions rather than a bespoke process to say, look, we think if you could answer these questions, you'd be more than likely starting to take a systems approach. But we acknowledged at the point that some process, some framing of this might be useful to look at in the future. And I cannot count the number of times somebody said to me that it's not rocket science, it's just common sense. And while we saw islands of excellence in improvement around the health and care system, common sense is not common. So it's really interesting that we put the report out at the back end of 2017, and it landed really well with our health and care colleagues, improvers. It clearly was a language that captured what we thought about in engineering, but in a language that was accessible to the health and care professionals and improvers. And I think it's been one of the more influential reports that the Academy has been able to put out there. And we always thought that what we'd do is translate that into some sort of toolkit And it's fundamentally, we're just trying to answer these two core questions. How can we do it better? And what could possibly go wrong? So in a sense, that was the end of phase one of what I wanted to talk about. And so this was published just over nearly 3 years ago. And ever since then, my team have been focusing more on, well, how do we translate that toolkit concept, the toolbox, into something we call now improving improvement. So it's the same box, but what's critical is, well, what is inside the box? What are we designed to put inside the box? And how are we translating engineering better care, which is the what is a systems approach, to improving improvement, which is more about, well, how could we do it? And physically, it looks like a couple of files in a box. And the sharp-eyed of you would see it behind me on the shelf. It has a guide and a whole bunch of resources. And within inside of that, there's 4 key sections. There's one talking about improvement in general. There's one talking about the questions that came out of engineering better care. There's one that much more focuses on the process, which I'll show you in just a moment, and then lots of resources. And it's a really sort of dip in and out, find the things that would be useful type approach. And in the same way that we saw that spiral wrapping around existing improvement processes in the earlier work, this is exactly what we were thinking of here too, that the process is a light touch to frame how we might respond rather than a definitive process that you must follow. But it is all about the patient. The patient sat surrounded by people, things, and places that constitute the system that you're interested in. And when we thought really hard about what process should we use to anchor this, we thought about 4 key chunks, if you like. That's the understanding the context, define the problem, followed by develop the solution and collect the evidence. That's the iterative process of design and development. Underpinning that, you need to keep making the case for being able to continue and manage the plan to deliver the solution. All of that anchored around a common agreement of the scope of what you're trying to do. So that was the process framework we put together. We came back to the original concept of trying to move from current performance to something measurably better. And you can see that hexagon punctuates the potential stages you might have within that process. So in the early phase, you'd be looking for the context and the problem. In the latter stage, more the solution and the evidence. It brings to mind other questions. So what do we do now? How do we perform now? So do we need to improve? And if we need to, how could we improve and what should we measure? And what is the case for change and what is the plan for change? What should we do next? So these additional questions become part of the set that we then put together and expanded from the original. So there's now 18 questions around the central 19th question is what do we do next? But still the same iterative nature, the same form that predominantly on the right, it's about problem exploration, problem seeking, and on the left-hand side, more problem solving. In terms of what we created, we put a whole bunch of cards together. These are A7 cards, small cards to put in people's hands that prompt them for different stakeholders, patient stakeholders, carer stakeholders, different case studies, just to help them say, well, are these people important to what I'm trying to do? We have a whole bunch of cards about activities, about different tools, about the original questions. And most importantly, probably about language. So the 2 I put there as an example, we put definitions of journey and pathway in the kit. Because clinicians talk about pathways, but patients talk about journeys. It's really important to understand the difference and have that discussion early on as to, well, why is the difference important to your particular project? We also put together a whole bunch of templates that could be printed out at any scale to help people design and deliver a process to help them deliver something measurably better. And a bunch of posters that bring to life some of the things that we thought were important that they might want to know. If I just illustrate that very briefly by showing at the front end of the process. So if we look just at the understand phase in this journey, the sort of things we'd coach people to do is to look at the stakeholders. Now, there's many ways to do that. And one of the forms we have is to define a stakeholder map. And we might encourage people to look for internal or external stakeholders. We might prompt them with particular categories of stakeholders, ideally with the patient at the center. The cards that we've shown you briefly on screen, we might use those on top of an A0 plot of this map. So we really want to understand the stakeholders, because that's very important in deciding who should be in, who should be out, who's has influence of what you're doing, who should be interested, and it helps you bound the scale of the problem. And then something we found that's really useful is a canvas, which is a big blank sheet of paper where the boxes represent the parts of the hexagon, with 2 additional ones added on there, which is identify the stakeholders and build the team. And the idea is to capture what you know at a particular point in time that you could put in any of those boxes. And what this allows for is that if somebody comes to you and they think they actually know the solution, they can write that in the box. And it might be evident that they know very little about the context, or maybe even what the problem is, and you can start to interrogate that. Or they might come along and tell you everything about the context and are struggling to articulate the problem and have no idea about the solution. So the whole point of this is to try and capture, what do I know at the beginning of this phase of the work? And in a sense, what do I need to know? And one of the things that we could use to help prompt them with this is that those boxes map onto the hexagon, and we can map all those questions around the hexagon as well. And it was only at the end, when we looked back, we saw that the majority of the questions we've defined in this whole process focus on understanding the context and defining the problem. It's front-end loaded. And I think that's critical, that if we're trying to encourage people to take a systems approach, it really is about trying to set off in the right direction that matters. People are generally far better skilled at coming up with the ideas and solutions and the evidence in their own area of expertise than they are defining the problem in the first place. So if we can use this to help them fill in the canvas, we can help them complete a plan. So if we see the scope column on the left as what they've learned from filling in the canvas, at that point we say, well, what do you want to get to at the end of this phase of work? What are the outputs you might want to define? And it may be I really want to understand the context and have a requirements definition. And I want to capture what ideas people have for solutions if they've got them. And you say, well, okay, so how are you going to get to that point? And we can fill in a bunch of questions or activities that then formulate the plan they need to follow for that stage. So it's a very simplistic, high-level way of saying that, what do you know now? Where do you want to get to at the next staging point? What do you think you need to do to get there? So this is the essence of what we've been providing for training now over the last 2 years for healthcare professionals, and over the last year for policy professionals. And we get to this point where we let them loose on a plan and with the canvas. And the question keeps coming up when saying, well, okay, so what skills, what do we need to be able to be or to do to facilitate this process? And it started me thinking, prompted by the Academy of Engineering convening a meeting about this, to say, well, what are we trying to emulate here? So if I then reflect back to what we might see in industry, we had the luxury of the chief engineer in a lot of the large complex programs or projects that you see. And the chief engineer at any stage of a project cycle works with and between their teams and the other teams at equal, lower and higher system levels to ensure a smooth technical program with no surprises or adverse consequences. And I think that picks up really well a lot of the answers to the questions, or what should come about if you answer the questions of a systems approach. And systems engineers evolved to be the people who are good at doing this, good at networking, good at understanding the context and the problem and what people could do to develop the solutions, good at understanding the communication across to other systems, sideways, up and down. So increasingly, as we've been taking this out to government departments and policymakers, the language changed subtly because they talk about systems leaders. But if you change just a couple of words, you could say, well, the systems leader at any stage of a policy cycle works with and between their teams and the other teams at equal, lower and higher system levels to ensure a smooth delivery program with no surprises or adverse consequences. And they're quite taken by this idea that that's ideally what they'd like to be able to do. And the conversation moves on from there, that unlike successful organizational leaders, systems leaders are distinguished by their experience of working across services and organizations, almost invariably in circumstances of considerable complexity. And that discussion of complexity keeps coming back into what we're trying to do here. Systems engineering, a systems approach, is often seen as being something you do when you have complex systems. And it comes back to the well-known Sinefin model. It says, well, systems are simple or complicated. They may become complex. maybe chaotic. And what I find interesting is when I observe the systems in healthcare that we're trying to help improve, the majority of the things we see individually are only ever simple or at worst complicated. And it's when you put them together and when you let the patient wander through the system that things become complex. And the more I talk to policymakers, the more I see the same thing, that the individual elements that they're dealing with are simple or complicated. As soon as you put the citizen or the member of the public in play and you connect departments together and information gets misplaced between departments, it becomes complex. So in trying to bring all the pieces of the puzzle back together and say, well, what are we really trying to achieve here? What is the end result that we'd like to see? I think what we're saying is that systems leadership is not about making the complex simple. That's not what it's about. And nor is the systems approach about making the complex simple. It's fundamentally about being comfortable in the fog, that you're asking questions, you can't quite see the way the land lies. You can't quite understand the context or the problem. You might have to develop parts of the solution to begin to understand more the context and that problem. But if you keep persevering, keep being comfortable in the fog, the ideal is that you then emerge to be able to solve the right problem and to solve it right. You're pointing in the right direction with the right tools and techniques then to follow it through. And that's a description that we find resonates absolutely with our health and care colleagues in improvement and with the policymakers. And if I go all the way back to my time working at PA, I guess what I didn't know at the time but could see since is I learned to be comfortable in the fog, trying to understand the client's needs and translate it to a definition of a problem that we might then be able to solve. But always in the early stages of the project, you had to be comfortable in the fog. So if I look forward and now say, well, what am I trying to do from a research point of view? We're trying to understand, what do people actually do in terms of improvement or policy making? What does a systems approach add to this process? And could we design a better toolkit or better ways of delivering the toolkit? And what are the risks in this approach? And does thinking change practice? Can we start to build the evidence that's saying this way of thinking, these questions we ask, can result in genuine changes in practice? In essence, what it's just simply saying is, how can we encourage common sense? So I'm going to stop at that point and just leave this slide up for a couple of moments. And that's the address or the web address of the toolkit. If you want to go and find all the bits and pieces I've been talking about, you can download any or all of it. You can download things you can print and use in practice. I'd welcome any feedback if people try using things, or if you think things are missing, if you think things are there that are of no value and shouldn't be there. So any feedback you have on that at all, please pass it back to me. And at that point, I shall stop sharing and take some questions.
Thank you, John. That's brilliant. I do have some questions. So we've got a kind of combination of some pre-submitted questions, some questions that have come in during your presentation. So I think I'll kick off with a question about convincing key stakeholders. How do you convince key stakeholders that taking a systems view of a challenge is a good approach?
That's a great question. I spent yesterday morning with a bunch of policymakers virtually in London and trying to understand their feedback on trying to use a systems approach. And I think three things came out that are crucial. And one was stakeholder analysis. So going through that process, trying to identify who should be involved and why, what are their needs, boundary setting. And the third was setting the core themes of what you're trying to deliver. Now, those things are intertwined. And one way we get to it actually is we say, look, let's think about the stakeholders. And most people can list half a dozen in seconds. Give them half an hour, they get up to between 30 and 50. If you then start saying, well, hang on, what are the needs of each of those stakeholders? Suddenly people's eyes start to open. They really start to understand, well, I know now why I'm asking these questions, because what I thought this problem was about is nothing like what it was about. So if I was to do anything, it would be a stakeholder analysis, but just push it a bit further, a bit deeper than people normally would do it. And that, say, the scales drop from the eyes and people say, ah, yeah. So we did a lot of work in palliative care, for example, to care for people near to death. And somebody said, stakeholder, Fred. And everybody's looking around saying, who is Fred? Well, Fred was the dog. the person's dog. And suddenly people thought, yeah, this is why we do this. You've got to think of the dog. The person's taken into a hospice. What happens to the dog? It's a really important question and a really important part of understanding what the whole process is about for the person going into care. And that was one of those transformative moments that somebody said, now I know why we're doing this.
Great, thank you. A question that's just come in that's interesting is, at what point do you check regulatory requirements?
That's a really good question. So I always think that early on, if you're trying to understand what the problem's about, you'll want to capture that sort of information to say, look, what are the regulations within which we need to sit? I also think that when you're trying to define the boundary of the system you're trying to change, almost at that point, you might ignore the regulatory requirements to just test whether the boundary you set should be wider. So I guess what I'm saying is that early in the process, where you're exploring the scope of what you're doing, we tend to try and do that without constraint to make sure we capture all the things of interest that might be of value. And then in a sense, you come to the problem from the other side and say, well, now I think I know what my ideal system is I should be looking at. What are the constraints I have to apply? Rather than put the constraints as something you cannot go beyond from the outset.
There's a question here about medical devices. So the question is there a systems framework that we can use in medical devices design and development?
I'd have to say yes. I have a colleague who's working with us with the Toolkit now, who comes from the medtech sector. And she's been talking to a lot of companies who ask for advice on their development processes. And she's been starting to explain what I've just shown to you. And it's been transformative for them in those conversations and saying, these are the questions that matter. But it's not about replacing the existing company processes. Those are important if that's what you're familiar with. It's just saying, well, how do we embellish them? How do we make them better? How do we focus them in a different way if we can ask these questions, say, wrapped around the processes that exist? And there will be the regulatory processes, the need for the design file and other things you need to do to get product to market. But I think some of these questions will help you focus the efforts and the direction earlier in the process.
Thank you. I've got a more general question here, which is about change management. Why is good change management so difficult to achieve?
I think one of the things I learned from doing this for many, many years is that good change management is predominantly about good risk management. It's really understanding what are the things you need to do in the order in which you need to do them. And somebody once said to me at PA, what's the least amount of the client's money you should spend before you tell them you should stop the project? And that's stayed with me ever since. That there are the showstoppers that you have to understand. But there is a flip side to it, and it's saying, well, how do you encourage people to change? And I think part of that is clarity in the reasoning behind why you want to change and why you want to move in a certain direction, and understanding what the challenges are for individuals and where the change maybe aligns with their sense of need or whether it's in conflict with their sense of need. And you can be empathetic to that and understanding and help to carry them with you. My own experience has been to find the biggest skeptics and then bring them into the team and work with them. So change management is never an easy process, but I think if you show that you understand what the process should look like and where the critical points are, then you can do far better at it. But risk is a key part of it.
Thank you.
I see a key question from Chris Lynn as well about lean and agile. Chris, one of the things we have done is we've looked at the IHI model of improvement, we looked at lean, we've looked at Six Sigma, and we've actually mapped the questions and the activities and tools in the toolkit against those three processes. And you'll see it on the toolkit website. And the idea there was not to shame those processes, but say, no, they're out there. They're very powerful when used well. They're very, very good. But what does this thinking add to or offer in addition to the way they're thinking? So what we've done is understand which of the things we've thought about those methods already talk about and show you how to do them. And then we flip it and say, well, here are the other things you could be thinking about if you were taking the lean approach. And so I think that's to be explored further. And we certainly don't want to stop people doing what they're doing. But again, if this broader systems approach way of thinking can add value to those approaches, then I think we've done our job.
Yeah, there was a similar question I saw about the DMAC process, define, measure. Yeah.
So it's entirely consistent with that. Yeah.
Just going back to kind of what you see in the future, there's a question about where you see the next big change in healthcare systems engineering.
I think if you go back in time and say, where has it come from? It's come from this prompt to say, well, maybe we should take a systems approach, and how that's been played out predominantly has been through modeling and simulation, curiously. And it sort of harks back to systems engineering 1.0, which is looking towards the more complicated solutions and ways of modeling the systems and making them better. And you see that a lot in the US. A lot of the systems engineering for healthcare is about teaching people to do better modeling and simulation work. And it very much has its place, and where used well can be incredibly useful. I've wanted to take a much looser definition here in how we describe a systems approach, and saying it actually is about everything you do in terms of the way you think about developing your service and changing your service. And how can we encourage people to take a systems approach? So for me, that would be success, is that people start asking these questions in everything that they do. And how might you think that could play out? And I have a lot of healthcare people that at the end of the presentation will say to me, look, John, I can't change anything outside of my particular niche area. So why is this so important? How can I actually do anything about it? So my response has always been, well, if you at least understood the other systems around you and what their needs and aspirations were, you could maybe change what you have control of in a way that is beneficial to the whole, not just your part of it. And I would want to go better than that and say, look, as we think about the boundary around which we can make change, can we expand that as is appropriate to take a more holistic view of the services we're trying to develop? And that is entirely in line with what's happening in healthcare at the moment. That the transformation partnerships that have been set up by government a few years ago are about rethinking, reconnecting health and care and well-being. And you'd have to say, I don't think they've gone as far as they need to go yet. There is progress, but a better integration between public health, primary care, mental health care, secondary and tertiary care, I think we are moving in that direction. And I think COVID, for all its challenges, is accentuating the need for us to move in that direction and to think of these more broadly connected systems in how we deliver more effective care.
That links really nicely to a question that we've got here about the patient. How do you involve the patient and how do you convince the professional that it matters?
It comes back to those two terms I mentioned earlier about pathway and journey. That it's hugely important to understand the journey. So if I go back to the palliative care example, I was in a room, I think probably 2-3 years ago, full of palliative care specialists and some representatives of patients, of course, not patients because they've passed away by then. And I asked a question, I said, what would delight you in palliative care? I didn't know what I should be asking the question because I'm asking about any other product or service. So what would delight you? But I asked the question and 2 hours later, we hadn't finished answering that question. And that was because I was surrounded in that room by people who passionately cared about the process, but were directly involved within it. And if I hadn't had that conversation, we would not have come up with Fred the dog and many other insights that said, look, there are so many things here that are hugely important before we as professional designers or improvers think we can do something better with palliative care. And I think that happens wherever we talk to healthcare professionals. Say, look, no, it is about the patient. And when I talk with policymakers, it was a revelation to them yesterday that when I was talking about stakeholders, I was including the citizen, the member of the public. And it sort of dawned on them, well, they're stakeholders. And the best of them are talking to the public about what they're trying to do. But many of them are not. And of course, if they're designing new policy that's going to affect us, there is some real value in talking to us about our stories and journeys. So we talk a lot about journeys. We talk a lot about stories, people telling us their stories as a way of trying to understand who they are, what their experience has been, what the journey's been. And we create personas that try and capture that help the designers and improvers never lose sight of the people they're designing for.
Is there a rule, or is there a role then, another question here, for intuition in a systems context?
I think there's always room for intuition. And again, we're not trying to drill that out of the system. I think this is why on that canvas we have the solutions box. It says, look, right at the beginning, you may have an idea of what you think the right answer is. I want to know it. I want you to write it down. I don't want to squash it or dismiss it because you haven't got there by some rational, logical process. We want to capture it. And we're running a training course in January for healthcare improvers on the systems approach. And we're going to spend a whole day on creativity. It's not quite intuition, but it's more at that flexible end of the spectrum. So look, anything you can think of is on the table. And somebody who's a good systems thinker, who's embedded in the system they're trying to improve, may well see things that others don't see. So somebody I worked for, who was a chief of nursing for many years, he was involved in training people to do root cause analysis. But his previous job was driving around parts of South Africa, deciding which clumps of trees were diseased and which were not. And he was brilliant at it, utterly intuitive. And then he went out one day with a colleague who said, can you just explain to me what it is you're doing when you decide that the clump on the right is diseased and the one on the left is not? And he couldn't do it. He suddenly lost that knack to be able to discern. And intuition is often formed of all sorts of signals that we don't quite understand that come together and in our heads give us a certain shout or answer or something we should follow up. We cannot ignore that. It's that sort of pattern recognition that might be going on inside the individual's head that's hard to replicate in any other way. But the best way to do it is to make it public, to bring it to the team, to challenge it, to see if we can build on it.
Thank you. What's been the most impressive transformation that you've seen through applying systems thinking within an organization?
From about the day lockdown happened, I've been in a meeting 8 o'clock most mornings with folk up at the local hospital. And it's about protective equipment for surgeons. And we started those calls with the surgeons thinking it's about a new face mask for us to do surgery under COVID. And I guess about a month in, we're saying, no, it's not really just about the mask. It's about the whole system. And the surgeons were struggling with this concept. We said, no, it's actually about making sure that any clinical practitioner has the right protective equipment, the right mask for the right activity at the right time in the right place. And we actually then started off by writing a survey with them that went out through the Royal College of Surgeons to say, look, what are people's experience? What are their journeys of using equipment and the challenges that brings? And we've had to start working with the company to think, well, look, if we could measure people's faces, could we come up with a bespoke mask? Could we fit them better to an existing mask? How does this fit with the fit testing that already goes on and the standards that most masks are designed to are for industry use rather than clinical use? And is it different that we're using a mask for half an hour or 10 hours? Oh, and what if you want to speak to the team? No, I can't do that with an industrial. So suddenly what was a mask design became rather more complicated. And we're now looking to get investment with a company to tackle this head on and say, what should a mask look like? What should protective equipment look like for surgery for now and into the future? So a complete transformation of their way of thinking.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of really interesting kind of COVID related questions that it would be interesting to kind of link into here, particularly one about a more time constrained setting like a pandemic. So how would this approach, which would do better given more time, be adapted to something which is more time constrained?
So that's the fallacy about design process improvement. So I've been living with that for 25 years. And you say, look, I think we can help you improve your design process. And say, we haven't got time. And then as you observe them, they've got all the time in the world to do the firefighting later when there's problems, but they haven't got the time to try and set off in the right direction. So it's a genuine problem. My answer to that is that the canvas I presented, if I had half an hour with the project leader and said, look, can we just quickly walk through this? I want to see where you've got to, what you think you know. That in itself is transformative. If that buys you 2 hours with the team going through it again and saying, look, are we aligned on this? Do we really know what we're trying to solve? Can we define the core themes of the problem? Those small steps can be instrumental in changing the way people think about what they should be doing. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it could save an immense amount of time later. So we know, for example, in the early phase of the pandemic, there was massive call went out saying we need more ventilators and people rushing to design more ventilators. The question that was finally solved, probably more than any other, is, well, can we manufacture the ones we've got, more of them faster? Can we just increase the supply? And that probably was the right question at the right time, but we didn't quite know it. And it might have been just sitting back a bit at the beginning and saying, rather than saying, look, we need more ventilators, what do we really need here? What's the real problem? What should we really be solving? And the answer might have been, well, you set off several hairs running, that you try different things because you want something to come back that works. But my view is the light touch, the quick start approach, which we have on the Toolkit website, said, look, if you're going to do anything else, just do a stakeholder analysis and fill in the canvas and do a plan. If that's the only thing you can do, it may help you move forward more in the right direction.
There's a link here about hierarchical organizations, which I think is a really interesting follow-on to that. So how does the improvement process work in a hierarchical organization? Is it top-down? Is it bottom-up? Or does everyone get involved simultaneously?
As an idealist, I would say you want to get all the key people involved. So you want to cut across the levels. It's not always easy to do, but that's what you have to try and do if you can. And the one area where I find that works particularly well, and actually is a great leveler, is risk assessment. That as you start to draw the picture of the system together and you ask people what could possibly go wrong, that is an amazing leveler, that anybody at any level from their perspective can say, well, this might not work because, or this will fail because. And I've been in a room where there's been people from the chief exec of a trust down to the porter sat around the same table going through that process. And they sort of eye each other up really strangely at the beginning of the afternoon. By the end, they're absolutely engrossed in the process they all own, talking about the things that can go wrong. And then you're in a very different place saying, well, how do we make it better? So I think there are things you can do that help people to engage in a very, very different way, where you want that insight from the bottom up, but you need that authority from the top down to do things as well.
What does that look like in the workshops that you run? So how many people are typically involved? How long does the process take?
So there are different types of workshops. So the ones we do where we get surrounded by a whole group of improvers from different trusts and different organizations. And they tend to be the people that stand forward and say, look, this is what I would like to be able to do in my local environment. And occasionally they might be the head of transformation in the trust. And we train them, we set them running on case studies we set to sort of cut their teeth and learn what some of the techniques are about. And then we get them to work on their own projects, and they run in parallel with each other, sharing their experience of them trying to do improvement. And that works extraordinarily well. There's other situations where I go into a single organization and get a team that's drawn out of different hierarchies together and go through exactly the same process, the same slides, the same exercises. And when it comes to them looking at particular challenges to which they can apply the systems approach, then somebody at board level might pick something in their world, somebody much further down the organization will pick something else. But we still get them to talk to each other and to share with each other and say, well, how could you help each other in observing what's going on? So I think it seems to work in all sorts of different combinations. And because it's so simplistic, it's not a do this, do that type approach. It's, well, what if we ask this question? How relevant is this question? What about this stakeholder? It's a much softer touch, a much softer challenge. And the other thing we know works really well is if you have personas, cards that describe different people, if you get people across the organization in the same room and you give the porter description to the chief exec and vice versa, and they have to read it out and act out that person for the next 20 minutes, that is utterly transformative, because people tend to enter into these role plays quite readily, and they do begin to understand the other person's point of view in a way that they couldn't if they just had a normal conversation with each other. So we do these things in different ways, and some are focused more on medtech, some on policy, some on the course we're running at locally in Madingley Hall in January is all about healthcare data. So people who are using data to improve healthcare services, and we're teaching them a systems approach. So they don't just go in and create code or models, they do it in the context of the system.
Great, thank you. What are some of the challenges that you might encounter when designing these activities to address particular problems?
That's a really good question, because when you get to the next level beyond this initial training and saying, look, this is for real, this is a real project, what do we do next? You really have to become the systems leader, the chief engineer. You have to be the facilitator, says, look, what would I do next? What do I think is the right thing to do? And you're surrounded by the team you're working with and understanding their constraints, the way they work, and trying to say, well, what would ideally we do next? What can we do next? And it is challenging. So if you've got a healthcare organization where the way they do improvements, they meet together for 2 hours every month, it's quite hard to know how you use that time wisely and how you get people doing things between the meetings. But we tend to pick up something that's bite-sized. So we might say, look, can we map the system? But if that's the only question you take to the meeting for 2 hours, you will never get anything done. So you spend weeks beforehand interviewing everybody and saying, look, what do you think the pathway looks like? And you go into the meeting with something that's nearly there. And actually what you're trying to get is the consensus, to fettle the picture, to get it right. And it's the same with anything you do. It's probably 10 times as much preparation than there is in the meeting time, where you're really having to drive the process behind the scenes. And the best improvers we see in the healthcare trust are doing the same thing in their own organizations. They're doing a lot of the legwork, the hard lifting between the meetings and workshops to make sure they get the most out of them. There's no easy way to find the people that can do that or to train them. I think it is training through practice. It's like my own experience years ago in industry, where the best project managers just appeared to be really good at what they were doing. And I'm sure it came out of years of experience, but they also bubbled to the surface as the best project managers, the safe pair of hands, the person who always knew what to do next. And at one level, it's finding those people and giving them the authority to be the systems leader that's probably as important.
That's great. I think we can probably squeeze in maybe 2 more questions. There's a question here about using systems thinking in a smaller group. So do you think it could be exploited for the benefit of a few stakeholders rather than the whole system?
When we put it together back in the academy, we always thought that it should work at the micro, meso, macro levels, at whatever level you choose. And I think it does, because I think whatever level you choose to operate, whatever level of scale, you're still a system within a bunch of systems. But you might say, look, I'm more bounded just near to where I'm working and what I want to change, whereas somebody up at the high level might look at something much bigger. So I think it adds just as much value to a localized challenge with a smaller team than it does on a big challenge. And if you were the sole project leader, I can still see the value in copying the sheet down, printing it out and writing on it, and it helps you collect your thoughts. The tools in there, you think, that one could be useful. And many of these tools can be used by an individual person or by a team.
That's great. I think we literally are on time now, so it just remains to say thank you ever so much, John, for your presentation today. And please do get in touch with us if you have any further questions. You can contact John directly. Is that right, John?
Yep, that's good.
That's great. Thank you ever so much for your time today, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.